Welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. You can visit Dr. Johnson's blog at benwoodpost.com. Dr. Johnson's works can be found at drbenwoodjohnson.com. You can also support Dr. Johnson on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. Welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. Welcome to you. Today is March the 29th, 2021. This is podcast number 66. Today, this is our final podcast in this season 8. We're going to wrap up our discussions about legal obligation. The topic today is censorship and legal obligation. Now, the term censorship here is used in a specific sense, and that means we're talking about a person who decides to, not to be a certain way, not to express the self a certain way, just to avoid, harm or injuries to himself, right? So this person decides to obey the law to avoid having to face the wrath of those who enforce the law. So the obligation itself is not inherent, it is not intrinsic, rather it is based on a self-imposed obligation, on a self-oppression or self-suppression. So in this context, the person decides, you know what, it ain't worth it, I'm just going to obey, I'm just going to do the right thing. So without further ado, let us delve right into it. What is legal obligation? I think I can ask you this question at this point, and I can expect you to give me an answer. You could give me an answer which would summarize what is a legal obligation. Over the last few weeks or so, we have talked about legal obligation. We have done so from different perspectives, from different angles. We've talked about legal obligation as far as the individual is concerned. We've talked about obligation as far as society is concerned. We've talked about legal obligation as far as the intrinsic expectation from the individuals. In other words, we have talked about obligation from a subconscious standpoint. Today, we're going to wrap up this understanding. In other words, we're going to wrap up this discussion. We're going to talk about obligation as a self-censor or a compulsion. You have to keep in mind that every unnatural obligation must be coercive. In other words, every obligation that is not innate in the individual, that obligation must be imposed, forced, superposed, juxtaposed on the individual or to the individual. That person has no say as to when to do and when not to do. The obligation to do this, that, and that, or the obligation not to do this, that, and that, is not based on the discretion of the person. And that is why an obligation at inception must use a threat of some damage, some injury, some harm to the individual. Otherwise, you would not have an obligation. Because to be obligated is to have consequences that come with that obligation. If there are no consequences to that compulsion, so to speak, you could not be obligated. You might be recommended. You might be advised. You might be encouraged, but you would not be obligated. The word obligation implies a compulsion which has absolutely nothing to do with whatever it is that you want to do. And that is why in the beginning of this conversation, we have talked about the notion of consent. Because the fallacy of legal obligation is that somehow the individual consented to it. But in fact, if you were to look at the term obligation in and of itself, that is, semantically speaking, there's no way an obligation could be a discretion. There's no way an obligation could be based on what the individual wants to do at a particular point in time. So every obligation, to say it again, or perhaps to repeat myself, must come with a threat of force. So when we're talking about self-censor, what you have to consider is that the individual must, at first, impose that obligation on himself. The individual must first obligate himself. And in doing so, the obligation would become intrinsic to the extent that the individual would just obligate themselves as if it were a natural thing to do. But initially, the individual has to obligate himself. And that tendency to obligate the self comes from the child, from the way the child was brought up, the way the child was reared. And every child is reared to obey. Every child, so long as he is not a rebel, to the extent that he has absolutely no respect for authority, is going to obey. And that is where the individual learns to obey, learns to obligate the self, and understands the ramifications of not obeying or not forcing the self to obey. So the individual must, and it is an obligation to the extent that the individual ought to force the self to do that. So the individual must engage in what I call self-oppression. The individual must oppress the self. The individual must engage in self-suppression. The individual, in this case, must suppress his urges, his desires, his needs, which are usually natural to the extent that the individual could never suppress those needs, those urges. But that is what it takes for the individual to obey, to obligate the self. So the individual must get to a point where he could force the self to be a certain way. And the individual, sometimes, when he is evolving in a collective environment or in a society where everybody is doing the same, the individual may feel the pressure to be a certain way. For example, I might not have been brought up in this particular social environment, but now I find myself in it and everybody is behaving a certain way. I am going to obligate myself to behave that way, regardless of my sort of upbringing as far as the realities of that social milieu. So I am going to obligate myself because there's going to be a sense of pressure. You could call that peer pressure. You could call that collective pressure, societal pressure, but there is going to be a pressure onto the individual to be a certain way. Of course, you still have the threat of force that is standing by. And that threat of force is in the face of the police or entities, institutions that are designed to suppress the individuals. But to avoid getting to that point, the individual must first oppress himself, must first suppress himself. So the obligation must become a natural state of mind, where the person naturally believes, naturally obeys, naturally obeys. And when I say naturally, I'm not referring to nature in and of itself. I'm referring to this ease in obedience, to his facility to obey without really forcing the self to the extent of having this constant fight of forcing the self. It becomes a sort of a lucid way of being just to obey. For example, you're driving your car on a road that says 25 miles an hour. You don't need the cops to tell you need to slow down. So you automatically slow yourself down. Because it becomes this fluidity and the way you see the law and you see your obligation to do. You know you're not supposed to kill another human being, even if you might have the urge for X or Y reason, but you are going to, automatically, suppress that urge, suppress that desire. You may have a desire to hurt someone, to launch at somebody and then physically assault them, but you are going to innately, naturally suppress that urge because you know the consequences. And that is why it is important. And I've said it in numerous times and several occasions, and I'm going to continue repeating it. I am not against society. I am not against the law. I couldn't be. Now, you may disagree with what I have said here so far because some of what I've said, could be considered unorthodox. You're not going to hear these kinds of discussions in most universities for the fear that you might rebel. You might decide not to obey at all. I don't see it this way. I think the citizen is going to do the right thing so long as the right thing is the right thing to do. You don't need to force somebody into being righteous. Okay, I don't believe in that. I don't believe in forcing people to be righteous. And that is why I always talk about the COVID-19, because I think it is a prime example of how our leaders, so-called, don't trust us to do the right thing. And they're right to some extent, I would admit, sadly, of course. But it's this idea that they sort of took over our lives. But hey, if that is the reality, don't lie to me about it. Don't tell me that I get the last words when in fact I don't. And I think when you treat the person with respect, you let them know, hey, look, you live in a society, you don't have a say. We decide, and that's the end of it. Okay? So the idea that you're free, we're going to uphold your rights, that's complete nonsense. It doesn't exist anywhere where we have a society. So I think that is where we are. We have to let the citizen know what's going on. And a lot of people go through life thinking that they have a say in things, thinking that they have a right to be this way or that way. And they find out, sometimes in the most vexing manners, that it was not the case. And sometimes they ended up losing their lives. A lot of shootings between police officers and citizens are the results of the citizen thinking that he or she had a right to resist, or a right to say no to the injustice that he perceived that was being portrayed to him. And I remember a few years back, a police officer showed up at my house, and that officer started treating me as if I were some sort of a criminal. And for a split second, it crossed my mind. I'm looking at this guy who's disrespecting me in front of my wife and my kids. I'm like, what do I do? But I had to sort of pull back. I'm like, okay, no. And I'm going to let him get away with it. He did get away with it. When I reported the incident to the police chief, he said, well, we're going to investigate. Guess what happened? They invited me to the police station to have a conversation. Next thing you know, I'm sitting in a room with a couple of detectives, and they're questioning me like I'm a thief, like I'm some kind of a criminal, So now, of course, I learned my lesson. I understand how American society works as far as law and order is concerned, because I didn't know that before. Now I do. I do now. I do. But before that, I assumed that if I did the right thing, I kept quiet and I do what he wanted to the extent that I could, it would be the end of it. But this guy came to my house and treated me like I'm a criminal. And I couldn't believe it. Of course, we could go into the old cliches because I'm black, it's racism, it's all that. Yeah, there was that. But there's also the fact that this guy thought he had the authority to tell me what to do. And how dare you disobey? How dare you not agree with what I'm saying? And I, as a former police officer, I knew what he was doing. The way he was talking to me, I knew instinctively that's what he was doing. And I couldn't, and that's why for a split second, I'm like, no. I wanted to fight back, but again, we're not going to talk about me here. But the point is that be upfront with the citizen. Let the citizen know that you have no rights in the society. You have no say. Whatever we say is what goes. Once the citizen knows that, the individual is going to behave a certain way because the expectations are clear. Okay? But the assumption that you have rights, you get to decide, you get to be, and find out later on that that wasn't the case, then, and here's what's funny about the whole thing. The law enforcement, they're known for their dishonesty. And that is why when I was a police officer, it was a difficult thing for me. I couldn't be in this group. Now, I'm not suggesting that I'm a perfect human being, but I'm an honest person to the extent that I can. So these police officers, it seems like you have to be dishonest. When you encounter a citizen, whether the citizen was wrong or right, you have to say things to make him look bad, which would justify your behavior. And that is what they do. Now, again, I didn't know that. Of course, I had heard rumors about American police, but that day I found out that's who these people are. But the point is this. The individual has to come to a point where he or she self-censor. And in doing so, the person is going to self-obligate. Okay? And the obligation becomes an innate desire to be. Not necessarily because it is natural, rather it is because the individual has learned to obligate the self to a point where it becomes part of the being. It becomes part of the normal. It becomes part of the person. That's what I do. I obligate myself. I follow the rules. I obey the law. And that's the way I'm a law-abiding citizen. Some people are proud to say that. I'm proud to say that I'm a law-abiding citizen. That's because I have learned to obligate myself. I have learned to follow the rules. I don't do it because I'm afraid of the police per se, but I do it because I don't want to have to deal with that. I don't want to have to be subjected to this inhumane behavior of some other person because he or she feels like, he or she has the power over my personhood. So I'm just to avoid that encounter, I'm going to obligate myself every chance I get. Every chance I get, I'm going to obligate myself. But the point is this. The obligation has to come from the individual himself. And one of the reasons the individual has to obligate themselves, it is because there's always an expectation for compliance. You are expected to comply. You are expected, like I said, to do the right thing. And the right thing is to follow the law, is to obey the law. So the individual is going to obligate the self to be a certain way because that is the right thing to do. And that expectation of compliance is sort of justify the consent. Okay? Because you're expected to comply. That expectation is based on the fact that you accepted to comply. You accepted to obey. You accepted the laws. You accepted to be subjected to whatever laws that are in effect in this particular social milieu. And that consent, once given, cannot be revoked. You could not change your mind and say, well, I don't want to be a part of society anymore. I don't want to follow the rules anymore. It's irrevocable. Once you've given that consent, it is forever. Again, you did not necessarily give that consent, at least not explicitly. But it is assumed that the fact that you are here, you consented. And once you consented, you cannot say, I don't consent anymore. It's like you getting on an airplane going into a country. Regardless of the fact that you may or may not know about the laws in that society, the minute you land in that country, you are subjected to the laws of that country. And the minute you are in that country, you accepted, at least the assumption, at least the implications, is that you agreed, you consented to the laws of that country. And you cannot say, I don't agree to that. The only way in this case you could sort of disagree to being in that country is by not being in that country. Therefore, get in an airplane and go back where you come from. But even then, you still have to go through some hoops, some hurdles, which sometimes require you to obligate yourself to obey. And that's the sensical idea about obligation. It's like it doesn't really start at a particular point, and it doesn't really end at a particular point. It's like you're condemned to be a slave. You're condemned to obligate yourself. And that is the reality a lot of people must deal with. And like I said, some people have obligated themselves to a point where it becomes a natural thing to do. Most people would see nothing wrong in obeying the law of this country or that country or that place or this place, because to them there's nothing wrong. It's natural for them to obey whatever law is in effect in a particular social milieu. And that's because that person has learned to self-oppress, self-censure, self-suppress, because the person still have the needs, still have the urges not to obey, still have the urges to be a certain way. But that individual is going to oppress, suppress the self to the extent that the individual wants to be perceived as being a righteous person. And the reason it is important to obey the law, it is this idea of law and order, when we're talking about law, order, obedience, what we're talking about we need to have laws to create order. And in order to have that order, we expect the citizen to obey. In other words, we need law. For that law, we're going to get order. And to get that order, we need obedience. So these three go hand in hand or together. They go together. You cannot have law without order, or you cannot have order without law, and you cannot have either or without obedience. And like I said before, problems arise when you have what we call the supremacy of law enforcement. Okay, the supremacy of law enforcers, where you have individuals who represent the law, but who also act as if they were the law. And that is usually the police. And the example I gave earlier about the police being at my home sort of was an indication of that supremacy. And I felt it during the conversation I was having with this person. So he was talking to me in such a way that indicated he felt somehow he was on a higher moral ground. He was somewhere on top and I was somewhere at the bottom, and I had to obey everything he wanted. And I was, no, this is my home. This is my house. At least there's a minimum, there's a minimum respect you owe me here. I understand if I'm in the public area, you could come here and try to tell me you're God, and I might, let you get away with it. But here in my home, no, a minimum respect you owe me here. And that's what we see many a time. The supremacy of law enforcement is what caused most of the, unnecessary shootings we have seen across America. Is this police officer who sort of overlooks his duties, who oversteps his boundaries over the citizen, right? It's this idea that you are supposed to obey, you were supposed to obey, you were assumed to have consented to whatever I'm doing to you, and how dare you say no? That's how I could put it into words. How dare you say no to a police officer? In my country, we have those police officers who act like they're God. They have the right of death or life or death over anybody. In my country, a police officer could look at you and goes, "Maritu." In other words, you're under arrest. And we're like, "Why did you arrest me?" That's going to be enough for you to be killed, to be battered and physically abused. Once the police officer says you are under arrest, you have absolutely no rights that he must acknowledge. And in my country, this is this barbarian approach to law enforcement where the officer acts like he's God, And here in America, it's the same, only the officer doesn't say it that way, but he does act that way. And that is why, coming from a third world country, when I came to America, I was sort of amazed to see, well, is that what this country is about? Is that what these people are about? Yet they claim to believe in democracy and all of that. It was sort of amazing for me. It was a really amazing experience for me to witness that the American people were sort of like, the American police in particular, they had absolutely no respect for human rights. They don't believe in it. I mean, no American person is going to make me believe that America believes in human rights. Now, this is another conversation. We're not here to talk about America, but it's just the point. Just the point I'm trying to make here, that the police officer here in America has this understanding that he is supreme. And when he is dealing with a black person usually, or an immigrant, he senses that you have an accent, that you're sort of not from around here, and he's going to act like you have absolutely no rights. And it's quite amazing to me to see. So the supremacy of law enforcers is based on the notion that the police officer or the law enforcer thinks that he is supreme. He is the law. Therefore, you have no way to disagree with whatever he says. And if he does something to you that you somehow complain, they're going to lie about it. They're going to lie. They're going to say, well, that's not what happened. And unless you have, in my case, I have a video, I have audio recording of what happened. That is why, it's sort of amazing to see what they're going to say. But the police officer here in America, they are going to lie. They have absolutely no morals, no self-respect, I would say this word. They're going to lie because somehow they feel like they're above the law themselves simply because they're law enforcers. That's what I've seen in America. If I'm wrong, please let me know. But I think that's what I've seen being in this country for more than half of my life so far. So in this case, you have absolutely no right to disagree, to disobey, or to question the reason for obedience. The reason for your for obeying a particular law or whatnot. Okay, so and that is why I found out that most people prefer to suppress their urges to do otherwise, their urges to disobey. Most people prefer to suppress their desire to be a certain way just to avoid having to face the wrath of law enforcers, law enforcement entities, because at the end of the day, you do not have the physical means to fight back against those people, because again, they're part of a machine, they're part of a group, a clan, or you could call that a gang, if you will, that enforce the law, that enforces the law, that enforces certain rules, and you have absolutely no say. And if you want to live to see another day, you have to compel yourself, you have to obligate yourself, and you have to force yourself to be a certain way. In other words, you have to self-censor, you have to self-oppress, you have to self-suppress, and this is the only way you are going to live to see another day. And that is what I highly recommend to every human being on this planet.